I would like to acknowledge that we are on Dakota land. I'm grateful for and humbled by this opportunity to borrow this place and time for our coming together. We share experiences, albeit different in kind and scope, of dispossession, dislocation, and decimation, but we also come together in a spirit of justice, redress, and humanity. I want to first of all call attention to my title, which is so long that if I read it, I would probably use up my entire time. I think there's probably an inverse relationship between title length and substance. The longer the title, the less you have to say. So I think I owe you all an apology, if not reparations, for this pedantic title. I'm very sorry. I want to thank the organizers of this, all of you, and I was deeply moved by the presentations yesterday, and I have another confession, and that is I revised my presentation based on yesterday's remarkable talks. I was up till 4 in the morning, so if I fall over, don't worry, it's just me trying to maintain. I want to start, which I had not originally intended to do, with a brief story about how I have come to the Japanese incarceration subject and how I have come to the question of Japanese American redress and the broader questions about redress, reparations, repatriation, and social justice. I quite literally believe that I was born into examining these issues. I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, way back in the day. And Cleveland was the place that we called the Mistake on the Lake. When I was a kid, and it retained through my adulthood. I was born there because my parents, after they had been released from camp, decided that they wanted to move somewhere other than back to California. They had both been incarcerated in the Fresno Assembly Center, first in California, and then later in the Jerome so-called relocation center, both concentration camps, in Arkansas. After release from the camp, having signed a loyalty oath and been cleared by the FBI, my father then, who had been classified 4C, which was the selective service designation for enemy alien, was reclassified 1A, was drafted into the Army, and ended up serving in Army intelligence. A paradox to say the least. Following his release from the military, he served actually as a translator in the Pacific Theater and then in the occupying force in Japan. He and my mother decided to, again, as I said, move to Cleveland because they didn't want to face the likelihood of problems on the West Coast. I was born there. My sister and brother were both born there as well. We moved. My first home was in the so-called inner city of Cleveland, in an all-black neighborhood. I was brought up with all African-American kids in my neighborhood, in my school, and I felt like the proverbial nail that sticks up, the Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. And I felt a little bit like that. And so I was born into a sense of otherness and a sense of difference. And I had no clue why I had been brought up in Cleveland, of all places, and not in my spiritual home, California, which is where we eventually moved to. But during that time, I came to a realization that my parents, who had talked informally about camp life, were not referring, as you have all undoubtedly heard by now, to summer camps, but to concentration camps, where they spent up to 2 years confined behind barbed wire. It was at that point that I became curious and actually sort of obsessed with the question of incarceration. My father was an apologist for the incarceration, and he became, partly because of his veterans experience, became a leader in our local American Legion, which was one of the organizations that had lobbied intensively for the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. I had a difficult time, even as a kid, putting together this kind of contradiction. And so this became a divisive kind of wedge between him and me for the course of his lifetime. He died very early, at the age of 48, and I'm now convinced that it was partly due to post-traumatic effects. He had high blood pressure. He had ulcers. He had a difficult time dealing with stress. He was a type A individual who wanted to become the ultimate super patriot American. And he and I just never quite saw eye to eye on this. And so for me, the question of redress and reparations and healing comes down to the absence of healing, the absence of reconciliation between myself and my father. This is a question I've been trying to grapple with my entire life, and this is how I came to it from a personal standpoint. For my father and me, there was no apology, there was no redress, there was no reconciliation. So, 76 years after Executive Order 9066, which, as you know, was the executive order issued by President Roosevelt that set up the evacuation and incarceration of Japanese Americans, and 30 years after the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was the federal legislation that actually issued a formal apology and a $20,000 restitution per survivor. After this time, the Japanese American incarceration and even the redress movement has staked a claim in the public imaginary, especially since 9/11. And of course, not surprisingly, there's been a spike in Google mentions, in references, in allusions to the incarceration and even to redress since January 20th, 2017, an interesting date. Every other time the current occupant of the White House speaks, you can count on seeing some reference to the Japanese American incarceration or redress. In content and form, these references, allusions, and mentions have taken the form of memes, hashtags, trending topics, commonplace tropes, obligatory signs of wokeness by sunshine hipster progressives that take the form, for example, of an historical anomaly. It's been described as that, as a historical benchmark or watershed, an incendiary event that challenged the very nature of our constitutional democracy, such as it is, an object lesson, an allegory, a morality play, a legal and constitutional precedent, a paradigm case of systemic racism, a protocol for community organizing, and a framework to be emulated for pursuing other truth and reconciliation projects. Japanese American redress movement has been identified, again in the popular press, mainstream press, both online and offline, as a hedge and intervention on historical amnesia, as a canary in the mine, warning us about the toxic character of white supremacy, colonialism, and imperialism still extant in the United States, as an embodied liberatory practice, as a systematic and pernicious validation of neoliberalism, which is, I owe this to Guy Mount, who made mention of this just yesterday, that to some extent, some have characterized the redress movement and the success in the movement as a kind of reaffirmation and reproduction of the worthy citizens, the worthy victims of redress and reparations, which only reconstitutes and enhances the living presence of white supremacy, colonialism, and imperialism in our time. That's clearly not how most Japanese Americans view it. But from the standpoint of the ongoing sorts of injustices, the ongoing dog whistles, the ongoing crises around indefinite detention, around profiling and so forth, it's not a difficult argument to make that there is a dimension of neoliberalism in the actual approval and acceptance of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It's been also characterized as a community and grassroots inspired and executed victory for social justice. And finally, it has been identified as an indication, a marker of the persistence of settler colonialism, and as a counter, a decolonizing moment in framing both incarceration and redress movements. This, again, this kind of contestation has been characteristic, but little known, I think, among the general public, even among Japanese Americans, who have taken a critical look at what redress means in this context. Finally, popular culture has highlighted the Japanese incarceration in multiple and diverse ways. There was an episode on, of all things, Star Trek Enterprise ages ago about the incarceration. Farewell to Manzanar, the motion picture, episodes of Hawaii Five-0, recent series of Canterville cartoon strips have linked the Japanese American incarceration and a young child, George Takei, to the separation of families and the detention camps for recent immigrants and refugees to the United States. TED Talks have talked about it. The musical Allegiance featuring George Takei is about the incarceration. And of course, the unbelievable drunk history about World War II by Randall Parks. If you haven't seen this, check it out. It's on Comedy Central. It's unreal. He gets a bunch of stuff wrong, but it's a brilliant piece of work. And it will introduce you to the incarceration and to members of the so-called Fair Play Committee and Frank Emmy in ways that you will never have imagined. Okay, I'm also wearing a meme, and I'm sort of my own visual aid, I suppose, today. This says, no more shikataganai. Okay. This is a term that was used very commonly among especially the Japanese American elders, the first generation. It's loosely translated as it can't be helped. In contemporary terms, you would say, yeah, it is what it is. And so what it is has been interpreted as a sign of stoicism in the face of unimaginable adversity and degradation. But some Japanese Americans came to see this shikataganai as a passive acceptance and fatalistic acceptance of the incarceration. Those who objected to this were people like Frank Emmy. Frank Emmy was one of the leaders of the Fair Play Committee, which was a group of draft resistors who were at the Heart Mountain camp in Wyoming, and among about 300 others across the 10 camps, actively protested and resisted the draft. Many of them ended up in federal penitentiaries, and Frank Emmy himself, as a leader of the movement, spent 1.5 years for draft evasion, for conspiring to help others avoid the draft. He spent 1.5 years in a federal penitentiary as well. This guy is regarded as a hero of the movement, but not someone you would have heard about during the redress movement. None of the protesters were really in evidence in personal justice denied. They were mentioned in passing. They were not at the heart of it. People who were part of the military-industrial complex and the military regime were the folks who tended to be highlighted. A second quick meme is never again is now. This has shown up and has gone viral within the past several months. And here, what this suggests to me is that Japanese American redress is best understood as a history of the present in Foucault's terms. All of these memes, all of these representations are intended to trace the erratic and discontinuous process where the past became the present. Never again has been used, as you're all aware, as an historical trope, sometimes believed to originate with the Holocaust, never again. And you hear this with redress movements and social justice movements all the time. The notion of never again, however, is a way of deferring, I believe, our attention from what is happening historically in this present moment. And so the genealogy and the intent of looking at a redress as a history of the present is to, in a sense, develop a kind of effective history, to problematize the present by revealing the power relations upon which it depends. Let me take you through a very quick traditional history. I'm going to move at light speed now because I actually want to say something about NCLR. This is like speed dating. I'm going to go through these like one at a time really fast. this first slide is an attempt to really talk about the kinds of ways that we can talk about the starting point, the beginning point of the Japanese American Redress and Reparations movement. You can choose virtually any of these and make a case for how and when the redress movement started, including, I would suggest, the kind of resistance that went on in the camp. While that was a form of resistance and protest, one can argue that it was an incipient form of an attempt to redress the wrongs that were being done. My point is that it depends entirely upon your particular interest and your ideological perspective on what benefits you from saying, when did this all begin? Was it the resistance and struggle for justice when Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui violated pre-incarceration laws? Their cases went to the Supreme Court and were validated by the court, thus validating the incarceration. Did it happen in the 60s and 70s when all of this turmoil was going on? Anti-war movements, the blossoming of the civil rights movement, all of the sorts of mass sorts of protests and demonstrations around a variety of social justice issues. Did it begin there? One can identify any number of causes. Let me focus on the 60s and 70s. The 60s and 70s really are the start of the so-called modernist redress movement for Japanese Americans. And this was influenced by the civil rights movement, feminism, LGBT liberation, class consciousness, and a radicalizing of consciousness, especially around Japanese Americans who had resisted talking about these issues for 40 years. This was certainly true in my family. My father and mother would rarely, if ever, talk about it, and when they did, it was in the most superficial possible ways. And the only times they talked about it substantively is when I got in a huge argument with my father about it. Third World Liberation Front played a central role in the front strike at San Francisco State was a galvanizing moment. The Third World Strike at San Francisco State, the 50th anniversary of that is this year, was what is credited with having created ethnic studies. Black studies in particular, Latinx studies later on, Native and Indigenous studies, and Asian American studies as well. Pilgrimages to the various sites, the concentration camp sites, began occurring in the late 60s. And these, again, brought to the attention of the general public the existence of the camps and the question of what was going on. Here's a timeline that I'm going to completely ignore, except to say that the modernist period starts with 1970 and ends up in 1990. So this was a 20-year process of coming to grips with incarceration and bringing to the attention of the public and finally realizing a federal bill that acknowledged redress and reparations. Pivotal events in the incarceration included the rescission of EO 9066. This executive order had been operational, although defunct, since World War II, and not until 1976 did Gerald Ford finally rescind EO 9066. Secondly, the Coram Nobis cases. The Coram Nobis cases were about cases where there was a demonstrable attempt to delude and to hide evidence of innocence of the three people I mentioned, Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Min Yasui. Those went to the Supreme Court, and those cases, they never did go to the Supreme Court, but those cases ultimately were vacated at a lower level, and the Supreme Court refused to review them. The class action suit, NCLR, this is National Council for Japanese American Redress, was essentially a one-guy operation, although he had a series of followers. And this is someone who actually filed a lawsuit based on a class action suit trying to get $25,000 per person who had been incarcerated and their heirs for Japanese Americans. And this was an important part of bringing to attention the case of the redress and reparations. Let me move. That's through the rescission, Hirabayashi, speed dating, NCLR. Now, the critical moment in the redress movement was the passing of a law that created a federal commission, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. This was actually signed by Jimmy Carter, so the redress movement extends over 4 presidents' terms in office until it was again realized by its passage. The intent here was to review the facts and circumstances surrounding Executive Order 9066, and to review directives of the United States military forces requiring the so-called relocation, and finally to recommend appropriate remedies. This is regarded by some as one of the first national truth commissions, which we have heard about yesterday and widely about the value, and again about some of the potential limitations of taking the truth and commission path. For the Japanese Americans, this was contested vigorously within the community until such time as it was very clear that the only chance that redress and reparations had for Japanese Americans was through a potential commission that would come up, a so-called truth commission that would come up with valid recommendations. And so in 1981, 11 hearings took place in 10 cities, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, New York, and these featured some 750 witnesses, many of whom, for the first time, spoke about the incarceration. And I'm not talking about the first time publicly, but the first time in their personal lives. Many of them had never spoken to their families about this. A lot of the kids young people who were attending were utterly stunned by hearing their parents' and grandparents' stories about the incarceration. This was a monumental moment in the Japanese American community because it gave voice to the very nature of the injustice and the deep harm and injury that it caused to them and to their families. This was a huge, huge movement. I'm going to jump to and then overnight this, of course, led to the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. What I've, of course, skipped is all the lobbying, all the protests and demonstrations, all the community organizing that brought attention to this in the general public and in the Congress that finally led to the action that realized redress. What the redress bill did was to acknowledge the fundamental injustice of the incarceration, to apologize formally, to provide for a public education fund. We insisted on a community-based fund that would help to disseminate understanding, to make restitution to individuals for Japanese ancestry who were interned, and to make restitutions for Aleut residents who were also unduly and unjustly incarcerated in the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilof Islands near Alaska. This is the letter from George W. Bush. This is the first recipient of the apology letter and the check in 1990. And the conclusion of the commission was that the broad historical causes which shape these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Now, those three things sound very familiar because they're precisely the sorts of conditions that exist right now in this country. Never again is now. Let me repeat that. Race prejudice, war hysteria, war against terror in this instance, as well as war elsewhere in the world, and a failure of political leadership. Again, never again is now. Let me say, I'm running very short on time, and I want to respect my fellow presenters. National Coalition for Redress Reparations was a turning point for me in my life in trying to struggle through both personal and social justice collective issues about how I could enter into this struggle. One of the things that happened with the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations is that it emerged out of already existing activists around land development issues. Little Tokyo had been utterly decimated and destroyed. It was a very active urban enclave in the Los Angeles area prior to World War II, and it was diminished to about a 6-block square area following the incarceration. So they were actively involved in land development issues, tenants' rights, and so forth. There were other local community organizations involved, and at a conference in mid-November, the NCLR established its organization as a nonprofit, a grassroots organization. What's important in part to know about them is that the emphasis and the mission of this organization was to focus on grassroots, community-centered mission and praxis. This is about the capacity to mobilize, organize, and empower and authorize everyday people. Their principles of unity, this was all volunteer membership. They had no hired staff. They had virtually no budget except for donations from individuals and from some organizations. Principles of unity included monetary compensation, restitution, overturning the legal basis justifying the camps, and supporting others. This is perhaps one of the most important principles, supporting others suffering from unjust actions taken by the US government. The NCLR, prior to winning redress, stood up for African American reparations. They stood up for indigenous reparations. They talked about the systematic discrimination against Latinx populations, and they did this while in the midst of working for their own struggle on redress and reparations. They were the ones that provided and tried to provide a united front among the JCL, NCJAR, the 442nd veterans who were the very accomplished and acknowledged Japanese-American veterans who served in the war, and their allies. NCLR took a united front on this while there was immense infighting behind the scenes among these groups. This, for me, let me just say, by way of coming to a conclusion, this was a transformative experience for me. For me, this revealed the possibility of an organization acting and leading and making decisions horizontally. A lot of people and a lot of organizations have talked about horizontal or lateral decision-making and democratic participatory engagement. NCLR was one of the only organizations where I saw that actually happening. I'd been in some other social justice organizations. I'd been in universities, which is one of the most hierarchically organized institutions you're going to find anywhere, despite the ideology of faculty governments, which is a joke from my point of view. But the point is that NCLR provided an archetype for me of prefiguring change, that they engaged in ways, let me move to this slide as a way of conclusion, aligning organizational praxis with public advocacy and activism, accompanying others. This is that notion that we are going to neither appropriate nor defer, but that walking, we make the path. This is from the Zapatistas, the autonomous group in Mexico, and other groups around the world who talk about the importance of accompanying one another, not taking the lead, not following behind, but walking with. And finally, deferring reconciliation. Now, this may sound a bit strange, but what I'm suggesting here is that the end of the Japanese-American redress campaign is not the end of Japanese-American redress, nor is it the end of redress generally. Part of what the NCLR has committed to is an ongoing commitment to social justice issues. They changed their name from the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations to Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress in 1990 to reflect this ongoing commitment to injustices throughout the United States, globally, and to challenge colonialism and imperialism wherever it exists. Thank you.